In the spring of 1847, a cotton plantation in Alabama's Black Belt burned to the ground in a single night. The official report filed with the Dallas County Sheriff stated that the fire was accidental, caused by an overturned lantern in the gin house. But the enslaved people who worked the neighboring plantations knew better. They whispered a different story in the darkness of their cabins. A story about a girl who was barely 15 years old. A story about what happens when a human being is broken so completely that something else emerges from the ruins. Something that doesn't fear death because death would be mercy. Her name, the name she was born with, was Sarah. But by the time she arrived at Thornwood Plantation in the winter of 1846, she had been called so many different things by so many different owners that she had almost forgotten who Sarah was. Almost, but not entirely. And that small kernel of memory, that tiny piece of herself that refused to be erased, would become the seed of something terrible. Tonight, I'm going to tell you what really happened at Thornwood Plantation. I'm going to tell you about Marcus Thornwood, a man whose cruelty was so methodical, so carefully hidden, that his neighbors considered him a gentleman. And I'm going to tell you about Sarah, who discovered that the only way to escape a monster is to become something worse. But before we descend into this darkness together, I need to know you're ready. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Because once you hear what happened in those Alabama cotton fields, you'll never forget it. Are you ready? Let's begin. Dallas County, Alabama, stretched across the richest cotton-growing soil in the entire South. By 1846, the region was producing more cotton than anywhere else in the state, with plantations that generated wealth beyond imagination. The town of Cahaba served as the county seat, a bustling river port where cotton bales stacked 3 stories high waited to be loaded onto steamboats bound for Mobile and New Orleans. The plantation owners lived like European aristocracy, building massive Greek Revival mansions with white columns that could be seen for miles across the flat cotton fields. They hosted elaborate parties, sent their sons to universities in the North, and convinced themselves that they were the architects of civilization itself. Marcus Thornwood was 36 years old when Sarah arrived at his plantation. He had inherited the property from his uncle 5 years earlier, a sprawling estate of 800 acres worked by 143 enslaved people. Thornwood was not born into wealth. His father had been a failed merchant in Montgomery who died leaving nothing but debts. But his uncle, childless and impressed by Marcus's ambition, had taken him in at age 16 and groomed him to inherit everything. Marcus had learned quickly. He learned how to manage a plantation, how to extract maximum profit from the land and the people who worked it, how to present himself as a cultured gentleman while maintaining absolute control through calculated cruelty. He was handsome in a cold way, with sharp features and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He dressed impeccably, favored imported fabrics, and maintained a personal library of over 300 books. He could quote Shakespeare and Plutarch. He played the piano with surprising skill. He attended First Presbyterian Church every Sunday and donated generously to the building fund. He was by all appearances exactly what a successful plantation owner should be. But Marcus Thornwood had a secret that not even his closest neighbors suspected. He was conducting experiments. It started with curiosity he would later write in journals that would never be published. A simple question that became an obsession. How much suffering can a human being endure before the essential self is destroyed? How do you break someone so completely that they become nothing more than will and obedience? What techniques work fastest, which leave the fewest visible marks? How do you create a person who has been emptied out and refilled with absolute submission? These were the questions that consumed Marcus Thornwood. And Sarah would become his most ambitious subject yet. Sarah was born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia in 1832. Her mother was a house servant named Ruth who sang hymns while she worked and told stories about a grandmother who remembered Africa, who remembered being free, who remembered a name that meant morning star in a language that no longer had speakers. Sarah grew up in the kitchen house, learning to cook and clean, learning to read facial expressions and anticipate needs before they were spoken, learning the 1,000 small survival strategies that enslaved children absorbed like breathing. Her mother died when Sarah was 9, consumed by fever in 3 terrible days. After that, Sarah was alone. The tobacco plantation was sold when Sarah was 12. The owner had lost everything gambling on cotton futures that collapsed. Sarah was sold at auction in Richmond, standing on a platform while men examined her teeth and felt her arms and discussed her potential value. She was purchased by a cotton broker from Georgia who took her south along with 7 other people, all of them chained together in the back of a wagon, all of them leaving behind everything they had ever known. The broker sold Sarah 6 months later to a plantation owner in central Alabama who needed house servants. That owner died 2 years after that, and his estate was liquidated. Sarah was sold again, this time to a trader named Wickham, who specialized in moving enslaved people westward as new cotton lands opened up. And that's how she came to be standing in the slave market in Cahaba, Alabama, on a freezing morning in January 1846, waiting to be sold for the 4th time in her short life. She was 14 years old, though her exact age had been lost somewhere along the chain of sales and transfers. She had learned not to cry, not to speak unless spoken to, not to make eye contact, not to exist as anything more than a body that could work. She had learned to hide everything that mattered behind a mask of blank compliance. But she had not learned how to stop being Sarah. Not yet. That lesson would come later. Marcus Thornwood attended the auction that morning looking for something specific. He had recently sold away 3 house servants, all young women, all sold to distant plantations in Mississippi where questions wouldn't be asked. He needed a replacement. But not just any replacement. He needed someone with the right combination of attributes. Young enough to be malleable, intelligent enough to understand complex instructions, isolated enough that no one would notice or care what happened to her, strong enough to endure what he had planned. Sarah met all his requirements perfectly. The bidding was brief. Thornwood paid $850, a premium price that made other buyers curious about what he saw in this particular girl. But Thornwood had learned to trust his instincts about such things. There was something in the way Sarah held herself, a tension in her shoulders, a quality in her eyes when she thought no one was watching that suggested she had not been completely broken yet. That meant there was still something to break. That meant the experiment would be meaningful. He signed the bill of sale, took possession of his new property, and loaded Sarah into his wagon for the 12-mile journey to Thornwood Plantation. They rode in silence through the winter landscape, past fields lying fallow until spring planting, past other plantations with their big houses set back from the road, past enslaved people working in the cold to repair fences and clear drainage ditches. Sarah kept her eyes down, her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully blank. She had learned this posture so thoroughly that it had become automatic. But inside her mind was racing, cataloging everything she saw, searching for patterns, looking for the rules she would need to learn to survive this new place. Thornwood Plantation appeared in the distance as they crested a low hill. The big house was smaller than some, only 2 stories, but elegant in its proportions, with 6 white columns across the front and tall windows that caught the weak winter sunlight. Behind it stretched the various buildings that made up the working plantation. The cotton gin, the blacksmith shop, the carpentry shed, the smokehouse, the kitchen house, and further back, arranged in neat rows, the slave quarters where Sarah would live. Or so she thought. That first night, she would discover that Thornwood had different plans for where she would sleep. The overseer, a massive man named Booker who had worked at Thornwood for 8 years, took charge of Sarah when they arrived. He showed her the quarters, introduced her to some of the other house servants, explained the basic schedule and expectations. Everyone was polite but distant, their eyes sliding away from Sarah when she tried to meet their gaze. She recognized that distance. It was the distance that enslaved people maintained when they knew something terrible that they couldn't warn you about, when they had learned that trying to help others only brought punishment down on everyone. An older woman named Dinah, who managed the kitchen, gave Sarah a pallet in the corner of the kitchen house and a rough wool blanket. "You mind yourself," Dinah said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that Sarah didn't yet understand. "Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't give Master Thornwood no reason to take special notice of you." But it was already too late for that advice. Thornwood had already taken notice. That was exactly why he had purchased her. Sarah's first week at Thornwood passed in a blur of learning. She worked in the kitchen under Dinah's direction, preparing meals, washing dishes, hauling water, tending fires, performing the endless labor that kept a plantation household running. The work was hard but familiar. She had done similar tasks on every plantation she'd been sold to. What was unfamiliar was the atmosphere. There was a tension at Thornwood that she couldn't quite identify, a quality in the air like the feeling before a thunderstorm. When the pressure drops and animals go silent and you know something is coming but you don't know what or when. The other house servants, 6 women and 2 men, moved through their duties with mechanical efficiency. They rarely spoke to each other beyond what was necessary for coordinating work. They flinched at unexpected sounds. They watched the big house with anxious eyes, especially when Thornwood was inside. And Sarah noticed something else. The house servants changed. Every few months, someone would disappear. Sold away, Dinah would say when Sarah asked. Transferred to field work. Gone to another plantation. But the explanations never quite matched the haunted looks on people's faces when the subject came up. On her 8th evening at Thornwood, Marcus Thornwood summoned Sarah to his study. The message was delivered by Booker, who looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been pity or might have been relief that it wasn't him being summoned. "Master wants you in his study right now," Booker said. "You go up the back stairs, 3rd door on the left. You knock twice and wait till he tells you to come in. You understand?" Sarah nodded, her heart beginning to pound. She had been in master's studies before. Sometimes it meant receiving new instructions. Sometimes it meant punishment for some infraction she didn't know she'd committed. Sometimes it meant nothing at all, just another arbitrary exercise of power, a reminder that she existed entirely at someone else's whim. She climbed the narrow back stairs that house servants used, her feet silent on the wooden treads. The upper floor of the big house was quiet, dimly lit by oil lamps placed at intervals along the hallway. She found the 3rd door on the left, raised her hand, knocked twice, and waited. "Enter," Thornwood's voice called from inside. Sarah opened the door and stepped into a room that would become intimately, terribly familiar over the months ahead. The study was lined with bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with papers, ledgers, and writing instruments. Heavy curtains framed windows that looked out over the front lawn and the road beyond. Oil lamps cast warm light that created pools of brightness and deep shadows. The room smelled of tobacco smoke, leather, and something else Sarah couldn't identify. Something chemical and slightly sweet. Thornwood sat behind his desk, still dressed in the fine clothes he'd worn to dinner, a glass of amber liquid beside his right hand. He studied Sarah for a long moment, his pale blue eyes moving across her face with the same assessing quality he might use to evaluate livestock. "Close the door," he said finally. "Come stand here." He pointed to a spot directly in front of his desk. Sarah obeyed, closing the door with a soft click, walking forward on legs that had started trembling despite her best efforts at control. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor 2 feet in front of her, maintained the posture of submission she had perfected over years of practice. But something about this moment felt different, felt dangerous in a way she couldn't articulate. "Look at me," Thornwood commanded. Sarah raised her eyes to meet his, a violation of the usual rules, but he had ordered it, so she had to comply. His gaze was cold, analytical, completely devoid of warmth or human connection. He was looking at her the way a scientist might look at a specimen under glass. Something to be studied, something to be measured, something to be taken apart to see how it worked. "Do you know why I purchased you, Sarah?" he asked. The sound of her actual name in his mouth startled her. Most owners never bothered learning the names of their enslaved people, especially not newcomers. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I purchased you because I believe you have potential," Thornwood continued, his voice calm and conversational, as though they were discussing the weather. "Intelligence, resilience, a certain quality that suggests you might prove interesting." He paused, sipping his drink. "I'm going to conduct an experiment. You're going to be my subject, and over the next several months, you and I are going to discover exactly how much of who you are can be removed before nothing remains but obedience." Sarah didn't understand what Thornwood meant. Not that first night. The words sounded almost abstract, like he was describing a philosophical exercise rather than something that would happen to her actual body, her actual mind, her actual life. She would understand soon enough. That night, Thornwood simply questioned her. Where had she been born? What did she remember about her mother? Could she read? Had any of her previous owners taught her skills beyond basic household work? Sarah answered each question carefully, trying to determine what responses would keep her safe, trying to read his intentions from his tone and expression. But Thornwood's face revealed nothing. He asked his questions with the same clinical detachment a doctor might use during an examination, taking notes on a piece of paper, occasionally nodding as though confirming some hypothesis. After perhaps 30 minutes, he dismissed her. "Go back to the kitchen house. Tomorrow morning, you'll move your belongings to a room on the 3rd floor. You'll sleep there from now on. Dinah will show you which one." Sarah curtsied, the gesture automatic, and left the study. She descended the back stairs on shaking legs, her mind trying to process what had just happened and coming up with nothing that made sense. Why would she be moved to the 3rd floor? House servants who lived in the big house were usually older, trusted, people who had been at a plantation for years. She had been at Thornwood less than 2 weeks. When she returned to the kitchen house, Dinah was waiting, sitting on a stool near the banked fire, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Sarah with an expression of such profound sadness that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm room. "He told you about moving to the 3rd floor," Dinah said. "It wasn't a question," Sarah nodded. "Dinah, what's happening? What does he want?" The older woman was silent for so long that Sarah thought she wouldn't answer. Then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Dinah said, "Master Thornwood, he ain't like other masters. Most masters, they cruel because they angry, or they drunk, or they just plain mean. But Master Thornwood, he cruel because he's studying it, like it's a science. He takes people, mostly young girls like you, and he does things to them. Breaks them down piece by piece. Some he sells away after a few months, some—" She trailed off. "Some what?" Sarah pressed. "Some disappear," Dinah said flatly. "Just gone." No sailor recorded. "No grave, just gone. And we ain't allowed to ask about them. We ain't allowed to even say their names after they gone." The room suddenly felt very cold despite the fire. Sarah found herself having difficulty breathing, as though the air had become too thick to draw into her lungs. "How many?" she asked. "How many have disappeared?" Dinah shook her head. "I've been here 6 years. I seen maybe 8, 9 girls come through. Only 2 got sold away that I know of for sure. The rest—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. That night, Sarah lay on her pallet in the kitchen house, staring up at the dark ceiling, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. The fire crackled. Dinah snored softly from her corner. Outside, a dog barked once and fell silent. Sarah's mind was racing, calculating, trying to find a path forward. She could try to run, but where? She had no papers, no money, no knowledge of the land beyond Thornwood Plantation. The patrols would catch her within days, maybe hours, and the punishment for running would be severe, possibly fatal. She could try to get word to someone outside the plantation, appeal to some authority. But who? The sheriff was Thornwood's friend. The neighboring planters were his peers. The law itself considered her property, not a person with rights to protection. She could try to be so perfectly compliant, so utterly obedient, that Thornwood would lose interest in her. But something told her that wouldn't work. She had seen the look in his eyes during their interview. He had already chosen her. Whatever was coming had already begun. The only question was how she would face it. The next morning, Sarah moved her few possessions, a spare dress, the rough blanket, a small wooden comb her mother had given her before she died, to the 3rd floor of the big house. The room Dinah showed her was small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a washstand. It had a single window that looked out over the cotton fields, stretching away to the horizon in neat rows waiting for spring planting. The door had no lock. That detail struck Sarah as significant, though she couldn't articulate why. A room with no lock meant privacy was impossible. Meant she could be accessed at any moment, day or night, without warning or consent. The room was at the end of a hallway that contained 3 other similar rooms, all currently empty. This entire wing of the 3rd floor seemed to be unused except for Sarah's presence. The isolation was deliberate, she understood. No witnesses, no one to hear, no one to see, just her and whatever Thornwood had planned. That evening, he summoned her again. This time, she knew to go directly to his study without needing to be told. She climbed the stairs, walked down the hallway, knocked twice, waited for his command to enter. The routine was already becoming familiar, was already starting to feel inevitable, as though this had always been her destination, as though her entire life had been leading to this room, this man, this moment. "Come in, Sarah," Thornwood said when she entered. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening landscape, a glass of bourbon in his hand. "Close the door and sit down." He gestured to a chair that hadn't been there during her previous visit, a simple wooden chair positioned in the center of the room. Sarah sat, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her face carefully neutral. "We're going to begin your education tonight," Thornwood said, turning from the window to face her. "I need you to understand something fundamental. What happens in this room stays in this room. If you speak of it to anyone, if you show any visible marks or injuries to the other servants, if you give anyone any reason to question what occurs during our sessions, I will not punish you. Do you understand? I will not punish you. Instead, I will punish Dinah. Then I will punish 3 other people of my choosing. Then I will sell away families, separating children from parents. And I will make sure everyone knows that it happened because you couldn't keep silent." The threat was elegant in its cruelty. He wasn't threatening Sarah. He was threatening everyone she had any connection to, however slight. He was making her responsible for their safety, turning her silence into an act of protection rather than just self-preservation. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a small sound like ice breaking. She understood now, truly understood. She was not just trapped physically. She was trapped morally, trapped by the knowledge that resistance would harm others, that any attempt to seek help would result in collective punishment. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. "Good," Thornwood replied. "Now I want you to tell me what you're most afraid of." The question seemed to come from nowhere. Sarah's mind scrambled for an answer, trying to determine what response he wanted, what would keep her safe. But Thornwood saw her calculation. "Don't think about what I want to hear," he said. "Just answer honestly. What do you fear most?" Sarah's mouth was dry. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. But she answered with the truth because she sensed that lying would be worse. "I'm afraid of forgetting," she said. "Forgetting?" Thornwood's eyebrows rose slightly, the first real expression she'd seen on his face. "Explain." "I'm afraid of forgetting who I am," Sarah said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "My mother, my name, the person I was before all this. I'm afraid that one day I'll wake up and I won't remember anything except being owned, and that'll be all I am. Just property. Nothing else?" Thornwood smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "That," he said softly, "is exactly what we're going to explore. Thank you for being honest. It makes the experiment much more interesting." What followed over the next hour was not physical torture. Not yet. Instead, Thornwood subjected Sarah to what she would later recognize as a form of psychological dismantling. He asked her questions designed to undermine her sense of self. He forced her to repeat phrases that denied her humanity. He made her stand in uncomfortable positions while he read aloud from texts that argued for the biological inferiority of enslaved people. Texts written by doctors and scientists and philosophers. Texts that used complex language to justify something monstrously simple. When he finally dismissed her, it was past midnight. Sarah climbed the stairs to her third-floor room on legs that barely supported her weight. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind full of the words he had made her repeat. "I am property. I have no rights. My thoughts do not matter. My feelings do not matter. I exist to serve." She repeated her mother's name like a prayer. Ruth. 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 She tried to remember her mother's face, the sound of her voice, the stories she had told about the grandmother who remembered Africa. But the memories felt distant, harder to grasp, as though Thornwood's words had started eroding them already. This was only the first session, the first hour, the beginning. The spring of 1846 arrived with unusual warmth, bringing early growth to the cotton fields and long days of planting. The plantation hummed with activity as enslaved field workers moved through the rows, dropping seeds into freshly turned earth, covering them, moving on in an endless rhythm that would continue for weeks. Sarah saw them sometimes from the window of her third-floor room, tiny figures moving across the vast fields, their songs drifting up to her on the warm breeze. She envied them. At least they were together. At least they had each other. She had only Thornwood and his terrible lessons. The sessions in his study became a nightly routine. Every evening after dinner, Sarah would climb the stairs, knock on his door, enter his study, and submit to whatever he had planned. Sometimes it was psychological. Forced recitations, degrading questions, hours of standing perfectly still while he worked at his desk, punishing any movement with tasks that grew increasingly difficult, copying passages from books in perfect handwriting while balanced on one leg, holding heavy books at arm's length until her muscles screamed, sitting in uncomfortable positions for hours without moving. Other times the sessions turned physical. Not beatings, nothing that would leave obvious marks. Thornwood was too careful for that. Instead, he inflicted pain in ways that left no visible evidence. Pressure points that made her gasp and shake but left no bruises. Stress positions that damaged nothing but hurt intensely. Methods of inducing pain that he had clearly researched and perfected over time. And he took notes. Always he took notes. He kept a leather-bound journal on his desk where he recorded observations about Sarah's responses, her pain thresholds, her breaking points, her moments of resistance. She saw him writing in it after each session, his pen moving across the page with the same clinical precision he applied to everything else. She was not a person to him. She was data. She was an experiment. She was a question he was trying to answer through systematic destruction. By April, Sarah had started to fracture. She could feel it happening, could feel pieces of herself breaking off and floating away like ice calving from a glacier. She had trouble remembering what day it was, had trouble sleeping, had trouble eating. The other house servants watched her with knowing eyes and said nothing. Dinah left food for her sometimes, small offerings that Sarah forced herself to consume even though she had no appetite. But Dinah never asked questions, never tried to intervene. Everyone at Thornwood Plantation had learned that survival meant looking away, meant staying silent, meant protecting yourself because protecting others was impossible. Sarah began to notice other things about the plantation, things that didn't quite add up. The third floor where she lived should have been used for storage or additional servant quarters, but the other rooms stood empty except for a faint smell she couldn't identify, chemical, slightly sweet. The same smell that lingered in Thornwood's study. There was a root cellar behind the kitchen house that everyone avoided. Dinah had warned her never to go near it, said it was used for storage, and Master Thornwood kept the key. But Sarah had seen Booker carry supplies down there occasionally, had seen the overseer emerge with dirt on his clothes and an expression on his face like someone who had witnessed something he wanted to forget. There were inconsistencies in the number of enslaved people at Thornwood. The records Thornwood kept, which Sarah glimpsed once while cleaning his study, listed 143 people. But when Sarah tried to count the actual population, walking the quarters at dusk and observing the field workers, she could only account for 138. 5 people were missing from the count. Where were they? Had they been sold? Died? Escaped? No one would answer when she asked careful, indirect questions, and there was the matter of the previous house servants. Sarah learned their names through patient, cautious conversations with Dinah. Hannah, brought to Thornwood 2 years ago, disappeared after 4 months. Rebecca, purchased from a trader in Montgomery, lasted 3 months. Elizabeth, here for nearly 6 months before vanishing. Marie, Clara, Judith. The list went on, a roll call of ghosts, girls whose names were spoken in whispers if they were spoken at all. What had happened to them? Where had they gone? Thornwood never mentioned them, but sometimes Sarah caught him looking at her with an expression that suggested he was comparing her to some previous subject, evaluating her performance against theirs, measuring her breaking point against their documented experiences. In May, something changed. Sarah woke one morning and realized she couldn't remember her mother's face. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow. She tried desperately to conjure the image, closing her eyes, concentrating, reaching for the memory. But it was gone, erased. She could remember that her mother had existed, could remember facts about her, but the actual memory of her face had been deleted from Sarah's mind as cleanly as if it had never existed. This is what he wanted, Sarah thought with numb clarity. This is the experiment. He's erasing me, piece by piece, memory by memory. He's proving that a person can be unmade. That night, when Thornwood summoned her to his study, Sarah entered in a state of strange calm. She had reached some threshold, had crossed some invisible line where fear became something else. Acceptance, maybe, or perhaps just exhaustion. A recognition that whatever was going to happen would happen regardless of how she felt about it. You look different tonight, Thornwood observed as she took her usual position in the center of the room. Something has changed in you. Tell me what you're thinking. Sarah met his eyes directly, a violation of protocol, but she was beyond caring. "I can't remember my mother's face," she said. "You've taken that from me." She expected punishment for her directness. Instead, Thornwood smiled, that cold, terrible smile that never reached his eyes. "Excellent," he said. "We're making real progress. Tell me, Sarah, if you can't remember your mother, what else have you forgotten? What else is slipping away?" And he was right. When Sarah searched her mind, she found gaps. Empty spaces where memories should have been. She couldn't remember the name of the plantation where she had been born. Couldn't remember what her mother's voice sounded like. Couldn't remember if she'd ever had siblings. The edges of her identity were blurring, dissolving, becoming indefinite. "This is the most fascinating aspect of human psychology," Thornwood said, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone, as though he were addressing a classroom rather than the girl he was systematically destroying. "Memory is not fixed. Identity is not permanent. Under the right conditions, with the right techniques, a person can be made to forget not just facts, but themselves. You're proving my hypothesis beautifully." He paused, pouring himself bourbon, sipping it slowly. "The question now becomes, how much further can we go? What happens when there's nothing left of Sarah? What emerges from that absence? Do you simply become blank, an empty vessel waiting to be filled? Or does something new develop, something shaped entirely by submission and obedience?" Sarah said nothing. She had no answer. She wasn't sure she was capable of answers anymore. "We'll find out together," Thornwood continued. "But I must tell you, Sarah, you're doing remarkably well. Better than most. Elizabeth lasted only 3 months before she completely broke. Hannah made it to 4 months but became unresponsive, almost catatonic. You're at nearly 5 months now, and you're still present, still conscious, still fighting even though you're losing. It's quite impressive. 5 months. Had it really been 5 months since she arrived at Thornwood? Sarah tried to count backward, but the days had blurred together into an indistinct mass of suffering. Winter, spring, now early summer. 5 months of nightly sessions. 5 months of systematic dismantling. 5 months of becoming less and less herself until she was barely anything at all. That night, after Thornwood dismissed her, Sarah climbed to her third-floor room and did something she hadn't done since childhood. She prayed, not to the Christian God that plantation owners invoked to justify slavery, not to the distant, indifferent deity who watched human suffering without intervening. Instead, she prayed to the grandmother she had never met, the grandmother who remembered Africa, who remembered freedom, who had survived the Middle Passage and slavery, and still maintained some core of herself that couldn't be broken. "If you're listening," Sarah thought, her eyes closed, her hands clasped, her voice silent in her head, "if any part of you still exists somewhere, please help me remember. Help me remember who I am. Help me not disappear completely." No answer came. The room remained silent except for the sound of crickets outside the window and the distant murmur of voices from the quarters. Sarah was alone with her fragmenting mind and her eroding memories and the terrible certainty that Thornwood was winning, that he would continue winning, that there was no escape, no rescue, no intervention that would stop what was happening. She was being erased, and when the erasing was complete, when nothing remained of who she had been, Thornwood would either sell her away to some distant plantation where no one knew her history, or he would dispose of her the way he had disposed of Hannah and Rebecca and Elizabeth and all the others whose names were spoken only in whispers. She would become another ghost, another disappeared girl, another data point in Thornwood's monstrous research. But something happened in June that changed everything. A small thing, an accident, a moment of carelessness that would crack open a door Sarah didn't know existed. Thornwood made a mistake. It happened during one of their evening sessions. Thornwood had been drinking more than usual, his speech slightly slurred, his movements less precise. He was forcing Sarah to copy passages from one of his journals, the journal where he kept records of his experiments. She was supposed to copy only the passages he indicated, but in his intoxicated state, he left the journal open on his desk when he moved to pour himself more bourbon. And Sarah saw entries about previous subjects. She saw descriptions of methods and results. She saw notes about Hannah's complete breakdown, about Rebecca's attempted escape and subsequent punishment, about Elizabeth's final disposition. That phrase, final disposition, cold, clinical, terminal. Sarah's eyes moved quickly across the page, absorbing information, filing it away. She saw dates, saw names, saw a pattern. Every subject lasted between 3 and 6 months before their final disposition. Sarah was in her 5th month. Time was running out. But she also saw something else. She saw Thornwood's notes about the root cellar, the place where final dispositions occurred, the place where evidence was handled, the place where disappeared girls were made to truly disappear. And in that moment, reading those clinical descriptions of murder disguised as scientific observation, something hardened inside Sarah. Something crystallized through the heat of her suffering into a form she barely recognized. Not hope. Hope was dead. But something colder. Calculation. If she was going to disappear, if her final disposition was already scheduled, already inevitable, then she had nothing left to lose. Nothing except the choice of how she would face that ending. Would she go passively? Would she let Thornwood write the final entry in his journal and close her chapter with the same clinical detachment he had applied to all the others? Or would she act? The decision formed in Sarah's mind not as a sudden epiphany but as a slow, inevitable conclusion. Like water finding its level, like gravity pulling a stone downward. She would not wait for her final disposition. She would create her own. The next morning, Sarah began to observe Thornwood with new eyes. Not the eyes of a victim trying to anticipate punishment, but the eyes of someone studying a problem that needed solving. She noted his patterns, his habits, his vulnerabilities. She catalogued the layout of his study, the placement of objects, the routine of his evenings. She paid attention to when he drank heavily and when he remained sober, when he was most alert and when he was careless. She studied him the way he had studied her, with clinical detachment, as though he were an experiment rather than a person. It felt strangely fitting. She also began to explore the plantation in ways she hadn't dared before. During the brief periods when she wasn't required in the big house, she walked the grounds, mapping distances, noting the locations of buildings, understanding the geography of the place that had become her prison. She observed the overseer's routines, the patrols that rode past at night, the schedule of activities that governed plantation life. She was looking for opportunities, for moments when attention would be elsewhere, for windows of time when she could act without immediate discovery. And she found them. Every plantation had rhythms and gaps. Moments when the machinery of surveillance and control relaxed slightly. Times when even the most watchful eye turned away. But observation and planning were only part of what Sarah needed. She also needed tools. The problem was that enslaved people had no access to weapons. Knives were counted and controlled. Tools were locked away at night. Even possessing something that could be used as a weapon was grounds for severe punishment. Sarah would have to improvise, to find something that wouldn't be missed. Something that existed in plain sight but could serve a darker purpose. She found it in Thornwood's own study. Among the various objects on his desk was a letter opener. Not the small decorative kind, but a substantial piece with a 7-inch blade of carbon steel. Sharp enough to slice paper cleanly, pointed enough to penetrate leather, heavy enough to be effective if wielded with force. Thornwood used it daily, left it lying among his papers. A tool so ordinary that its potential lethality was invisible. Sarah had handled it before while cleaning, had picked it up to dust beneath it, had held it in her hand dozens of times without considering it as anything more than another object in a room full of objects. But now she saw it differently, saw its weight, its balance, its edge, saw how it could be concealed in the folds of her dress, saw how quickly it could be deployed if the moment came. She didn't take it yet. That would be too risky. If Thornwood noticed its absence before she was ready, everything would be ruined. Instead, she simply noted its location, confirmed its consistent presence, and added it to her mental inventory of resources. The question was when? When would she act? How would she know the right moment? Sarah understood that she would have only one chance. If she struck and failed, if she wounded Thornwood but didn't finish what she started, he would kill her immediately. Or worse, he would keep her alive and apply his full arsenal of techniques to punish not just her, but everyone at Thornwood Plantation. The stakes were absolute. Success meant Thornwood's death. Failure meant something worse than death. Through June and into early July, Sarah maintained her mask of compliance while her mind worked constantly beneath the surface. She attended the nightly sessions in Thornwood's study, endured whatever he inflicted, responded to his questions, performed the degrading rituals he required. But now there was a distance between what was happening to her body and what was happening in her mind. She had learned to separate them, to let her body be present while her consciousness retreated to a protected space where she could continue planning, calculating, preparing. Thornwood noticed the change. "You've become more compliant," he observed one evening in mid-July. "Less resistant. The fight has gone out of you." He sounded pleased, as though this confirmed his theories. Sarah kept her eyes downcast, her voice soft. "Yes, sir. Tell me what you're thinking right now," Thornwood commanded. It was a test. He asked this question frequently, trying to catch any hint of deception or hidden thoughts. Sarah had prepared her answer. "I'm thinking that resistance is pointless," she said. "That fighting only makes everything harder. That the only way to survive is to accept what cannot be changed." It was exactly what Thornwood wanted to hear. The words of someone whose will had been broken, whose identity had been successfully dismantled. He smiled that cold smile and made a note in his journal. What Sarah didn't say was that the rest of her thought continued in a direction he would never suspect. Resistance is pointless, yes, but revenge is not. Fighting what cannot be changed is futile, but changing what can be changed is possible. Acceptance is a mask, and beneath the mask, something is waiting. The opportunity came on July 19, 1847. Sarah would remember that date for the rest of her life, though whether that life would be measured in hours or years remained to be seen. It was a Saturday, which meant Thornwood had spent the afternoon in Cahaba conducting business. He returned to the plantation in the early evening, and Sarah could smell the bourbon on his breath from across the room when he summoned her to his study. He had been drinking in town, which meant he would drink more at home, which meant his reactions would be slower, his judgment impaired, his guard lowered. This was as close to vulnerable as Marcus Thornwood ever became. Sarah climbed the stairs to his study with the letter opener hidden in the deep pocket of her dress. She had taken it that morning while cleaning, wrapped in a cleaning cloth, positioned so it wouldn't shift or make noise when she moved. The weight of it pulled at the fabric, a constant presence against her thigh, a secret that only she knew. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain Thornwood would hear it when she entered the room. But he was distracted, sorting through papers on his desk, already pouring himself a glass of bourbon. He barely glanced up when she closed the door behind her. "I've been reviewing my notes on your progress," he said, his words slightly slurred. 6 months now. Remarkable resilience, really. Most subjects deteriorate much faster. But you've maintained coherence even while losing essential aspects of identity. It's quite fascinating. He drank deeply from his glass, refilled it immediately. Sarah remained standing in her usual spot, hands folded, head slightly bowed, the perfect image of submission. Inside, her mind was racing through the plan she had constructed over weeks of careful thought. Wait for him to drink more. Wait for his attention to drift. Wait for the moment when his back is turned or his focus shifts. Then move quickly. No hesitation, no mercy. Finish what you start. "Come here," Thornwood commanded, gesturing to a spot beside his desk. "I want to show you something." Sarah moved forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body, as though she were watching herself from a distance. Thornwood was turning pages in his journal, showing her entries about previous subjects, comparing her responses to theirs. He was absorbed in his documentation, his defenses lowered by alcohol and by his certainty that Sarah had been sufficiently broken to pose no threat. He had no idea that the broken girl standing beside him had been carefully reassembling herself into something new. Something dangerous. Something that had spent 6 months learning exactly how to hurt him most effectively. "You see here," Thornwood was saying, pointing to a passage in his journal. "Elizabeth reached this stage of compliance after only 3 months, but then she became non-responsive. Lost all capacity for independent thought, became essentially vegetative. You, on the other hand, have maintained awareness throughout the process. Much more useful for studying the mechanics of psychological dissolution." He turned slightly in his chair to reach for his bourbon glass. His neck was exposed, his attention diverted, his back partially turned. Sarah's hand moved to her pocket, closed around the letter opener's handle, drew it out in a single smooth motion. Time seemed to slow. She could see individual dust motes floating in the lamplight. Could hear her own breathing, impossibly loud in the quiet room. Could feel the weight of the blade in her hand, substantial and real and final. This was the moment. This was the threshold. Once crossed, there would be no return, no undoing, no reprieve. Everything that followed would flow from what happened in the next seconds. Sarah raised the letter opener and struck downward with all the force she could muster. aiming for the space between Thornwood's shoulder blades, the vulnerable spot she had identified through weeks of observation. But her hands were shaking, whether from fear or adrenaline or the simple magnitude of what she was attempting, and her aim was imperfect. The blade struck his right shoulder instead, penetrating deep into muscle and tissue, hitting bone with a sensation that traveled up the handle into Sarah's hand, a sensation she would never forget. The feeling of metal entering flesh, the resistance and then the sudden give, the terrible intimacy of violence. Thornwood roared, a sound of shock and pain and fury combined. He surged to his feet with such force that his chair toppled backward, crashing into the bookshelf behind him. His right arm hung useless, blood spreading across his white shirt in a rapidly expanding stain. But he was still conscious, still dangerous, still capable of killing her despite his injury. "You," he gasped, his pale blue eyes wide with disbelief. "You dare!" His left hand reached for her throat. Sarah didn't let him finish. 6 months of accumulated suffering, 6 months of systematic dismantling, 6 months of being treated as nothing more than experimental material, erupted from her in a fury of action. She pulled the blade free from his shoulder. The sound wet and terrible, and struck again. This time she aimed for his throat, but he had raised his left arm defensively, and the blade sank into his forearm instead, cutting through flesh and tendon. He grabbed her wrist with his wounded arm, his grip weakening but still strong enough to prevent her from striking again immediately. They struggled in terrible silence, both instinctively understanding that noise would bring others, would summon witnesses, would transform this private confrontation into something public, and therefore even more dangerous for Sarah. The only sounds were their ragged breathing, the impact of bodies against furniture, the crash of objects falling from the desk as they fought. Thornwood was larger and stronger, even wounded. He forced Sarah backward, slamming her against the bookshelf with enough force to knock the air from her lungs. His left hand closed around her throat despite the gash in his forearm, fingers digging into soft flesh, cutting off her air. Black spots began to dance in Sarah's vision. Her lungs burned. She was dying, she realized. After everything, after 6 months of survival, after finally finding the courage to act, she was still going to die. He was still going to win, but her right hand still held the letter opener. She had managed to keep her grip on it throughout the struggle. Now, with the last of her strength, with consciousness fading, she drove the blade upward into Thornwood's abdomen, just below his rib cage, angling toward where she hoped his heart would be. She had no medical training, no anatomical knowledge beyond what she had absorbed through months of being subjected to Thornwood's methodical cruelty. But desperation gave her strength, and luck guided her hand. The blade sank deep, finding something vital. Thornwood's grip on her throat weakened. His eyes widened with shock and pain and something that might have been fear, real fear. Perhaps the first genuine emotion Sarah had ever seen on his face. He staggered backward, one hand going to the wound in his abdomen, blood welling between his fingers. He tried to speak, but only blood came out, dark and thick, spilling over his lips and down his chin. He collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his hands. His breathing labored and wet. Sarah stood against the bookshelf, gasping for air, her throat bruised and burning, the bloody letter opener still clutched in her hand. She watched Thornwood struggling on the floor of his study. This man who had purchased her like livestock, who had spent 6 months systematically destroying her identity, who had documented his cruelty with clinical precision, who had murdered at least 6 girls before her and would have murdered her too if she hadn't acted. He looked up at her, blood on his lips, his pale blue eyes filled with an expression she couldn't quite read. Disbelief, perhaps, or recognition, as though he was finally seeing her not as a subject, not as property, not as experimental material, but as a person, as someone capable of action and choice and vengeance. "Sarah," he whispered, blood bubbling with the word. It was the last thing he would say. Sarah knelt beside him, the letter opener still in her hand, and made a decision. A decision that was both calculated and emotionally driven, both rational and insane. She would not simply kill Marcus Thornwood. She would unmake him the way he had tried to unmake her. She would reduce him to components the way he had tried to reduce her to nothing but obedience. She would treat him the way he had treated every girl who had passed through his study. She would make him understand. What followed would shock anyone who eventually discovered it. Would create a legend that would persist long after Sarah herself was gone. Would transform her from victim into something else entirely. something that represented both the absolute depths of human cruelty and the absolute limits of human endurance. But first, she needed to make sure he was truly helpless. She waited, watching as Thornwood's movements grew weaker, as the pool of blood beneath him expanded, as his breathing became more labored. She didn't help him. She didn't end his suffering quickly. She simply waited with the same patient observation he had applied to her during their 6 months together. When she was certain he was too weak to fight back, when he lay on the floor barely conscious, she began her work. She used the letter opener and other tools she found in his study. A heavy brass candlestick, a fire poker, various implements from his desk drawers, sharp objects, heavy objects, useful objects that had served mundane purposes but could be repurposed for darker ends, and she was methodical. Careful not to let him die too quickly. That would be mercy, and mercy was not what this moment required. Careful to work in relative silence, mindful that the house servants below should not be implicated in what was happening. This was her action, her choice, her responsibility alone. She was also careful to apply the lessons he had taught her. 6 months of systematic torture had taught her anatomy through suffering. She knew what hurt and how much. Knew the difference between damage that killed quickly and damage that lingered. Knew which parts of the body were most sensitive and which were most essential. She applied this knowledge with the same clinical precision Thornwood had demonstrated in his journals. Hours passed. The oil lamps burned low and Sarah refilled them from the reserve supply Thornwood kept in a cabinet. The mundane action surreal in the context of what she was doing. The summer night deepened outside the windows. The plantation around them settling into sleep, unaware that in the study on the second floor, something unprecedented was occurring. Sarah worked with methodical patience, dismantling the man who had tried to dismantle her, and as she worked she counted. It was important to count, important to document, important to mirror Thornwood's obsession with measurement and record-keeping. Each separation, each reduction, each component was noted mentally, added to a tally that grew with each passing hour. She counted to 143. 1 piece for each person Thornwood had enslaved on his plantation. 1 piece for each life he had controlled. 1 piece representing every person who had suffered under his authority. Whether this number was literal or symbolic would never be fully determined. Perhaps Sarah achieved it precisely. Perhaps the number was approximate, driven more by symbolic meaning than actual count. Perhaps in the heat of her terrible work, she lost track and the number became mythical rather than factual. But 143 was the number she would later claim, and it would become part of the legend. Part of the story that would be whispered in slave quarters across Alabama and beyond. When she finally stopped, when her work was complete and nothing remained that could be called Marcus Thornwood except separated components arranged across the floor of his study with terrible precision, the first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the windows. The sky was turning gray, the color of ashes, the color of endings and beginnings both. Sarah stood in the doorway, covered in blood from her hair to her bare feet, the letter opener still in her hand, and looked back at what she had done. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, no relief. She felt no horror or remorse either. She felt nothing at all, as though the part of her capable of feeling had been carved away along with everything else Thornwood had taken. Or perhaps feeling would come later, when the shock wore off, when reality settled in, when she had time to process what she had become. But in that moment, standing in the gray dawn light, Sarah felt only emptiness. A vast internal space where emotions should have been but weren't. She had become exactly what Thornwood had tried to make her. Something less than fully human. Something reduced to pure function. Something that existed only to serve a purpose. But the purpose she had served was her own, not his. And in that distinction lay whatever meaning could be salvaged from this night of horror. Sarah walked out of the study, through the hallway, down the main stairs, and out the front door of the big house. Her bare feet left bloody footprints on the polished wood floors, on the front porch, on the gravel drive that led away from the house toward the main road. She walked past the kitchen house where Dinah would soon be rising to start breakfast. Past the quarters where enslaved workers were beginning to stir. Past the cotton fields stretching away to the horizon in neat rows. She walked until she reached the main road, and there she stopped and waited. The letter opener hung loosely from her hand, its blade dark with dried blood. Her dress was stiff with it. Her hair was matted with it. She looked like something from a nightmare, like a ghost, like a warning. She didn't try to hide. She didn't try to run. She had done what she came to do, and now she would face whatever consequences followed. The patrol found her 2 hours later, still standing in the same spot, still holding the bloody weapon, her face empty of everything except exhaustion. There were 3 men, mounted on horses, armed with rifles. They reined in their horses when they saw her, their faces registering shock and confusion. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the patrolmen, a man named Curtis, who Sarah vaguely recognized from previous encounters, dismounted and approached her cautiously, his hand on his pistol. "Girl," he said, his voice uncertain. "What happened? Whose blood is that?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had traveled too far into darkness to ever fully return. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational, completely devoid of emotion. "I killed Marcus Thornwood," she said. "He needed killing. I regret nothing except that I can only kill him once." Curtis's face went pale. He looked back at his companions, then at Sarah again. "You killed Master Thornwood?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "He's in his study." "What's left of him?" "What's left of him?" Curtis repeated, the words sticking in his throat. "What do you mean, what's left of him?" Sarah didn't answer. She simply stood there waiting, the letter opener still in her hand. Curtis sent one of his companions to investigate while he and the 3rd man kept their weapons trained on Sarah. She didn't move, didn't try to escape, didn't do anything except stand and wait with inhuman patience. 20 minutes later, the patrolman who had gone to investigate returned, his face gray, his hands shaking. He dismounted from his horse, walked several steps away, and vomited into the grass beside the road. When he could speak, his voice was unsteady. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "Sweet Jesus Christ. It's true. He's dead. But what she did to him, I can't even..." He couldn't finish. Curtis and the 3rd patrolman exchanged looks. "We need to take her in," Curtis said. "And we need to get the sheriff out here immediately." They took the letter opener from Sarah's hand, bound her wrists with rope, and lifted her onto one of the horses. She didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't react at all. She sat on the horse like a statue, like something carved from wood, like someone who had already departed from the world even though her body remained present. They rode toward Cahaba at a quick pace, Curtis constantly looking back at Sarah as though expecting her to transform into something else, something worse, something that would explain what she had done. But Sarah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point that only she could see. Behind them, at Thornwood Plantation, the day was beginning. House servants were emerging from their quarters to start their morning routines. Dinah walked toward the kitchen house to begin preparing breakfast. Field workers gathered for the assignment of daily tasks. Everything appeared normal, ordinary, just another day in the endless cycle of plantation life. Then Booker the overseer went to the big house to consult with Thornwood about the day's work. He climbed the front steps, crossed the porch, entered through the front door. He called out for Thornwood, no answer. He climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor. The door to Thornwood's study stood open. Booker walked down the hallway and looked inside. The sound he made, a strangled cry of horror and disbelief, brought house servants running. They arrived to find Booker leaning against the wall in the hallway, his face the color of old paper, his eyes wide and staring. "Don't go in there," he told them, his voice shaking. "Don't look. Just get everyone back. Clear the house. No one goes upstairs. No one." But it was too late. Some had already glimpsed what lay inside the study, had seen enough to understand that something unprecedented had occurred. Within minutes, word was spreading through the quarters, carried on horrified whispers and shocked expressions. Master Thornwood was dead. The new girl, Sarah, had killed him. But more than that, she had done something to him. Something so terrible that grown men couldn't speak of it. Something that would become legend even before the facts were fully known. By noon, the sheriff of Dallas County, a man named William Pritchard, had arrived at Thornwood Plantation with a coroner and 6 armed deputies. They sealed the study and began the grim work of documenting what they found. The coroner, Dr. Isaiah Hammond, was a veteran of the Mexican War who had performed battlefield autopsies and treated injuries that would haunt most men for life. But when he emerged from Thornwood's study after 20 minutes inside, his face was ashen, his hands trembling so badly he had to clasp them together to stop the shaking. Sheriff Pritchard took one look at his expression and knew this was unlike anything either of them had encountered before. "I need a moment," Hammond said, his voice tight. He walked to the edge of the porch, gripped the railing, and took several deep breaths of fresh air. When he returned, he pulled Pritchard aside, away from the deputies and the gathered house servants. "William," he said quietly, "I've seen men torn apart by cannon fire. I've dissected corpses in medical school. I've examined bodies pulled from rivers after weeks of decomposition. But what's in that room, what that girl did, it's beyond anything I can categorize. It's not murder. It's something else entirely." Pritchard's jaw tightened. "Give me the details." Hammond shook his head. "I can write a report, but I'm telling you now, the details cannot be made public. If word spreads about what happened in that study, if people understand the full scope of what she did, we'll have chaos. Every enslaved person in the county will see it as inspiration. Every planter will see it as a threat that requires extreme response. This could ignite something we can't control." The sheriff understood. Alabama in 1847 existed in a state of constant tension, the enormous wealth generated by cotton balanced against the ever-present fear of slave rebellion. The memory of Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia 16 years earlier still haunted Southern consciousness. Any event that suggested enslaved people could successfully resist, could strike back with devastating effect, could challenge the fundamental power structure on which the entire society was built, had to be contained immediately and absolutely. "How do we handle this?" Pritchard asked. Hammond considered. "We document what we must. We seal the records. We execute the girl quickly and publicly. And we make sure the actual details of what happened in that study never become common knowledge. We control the narrative before it controls us." But controlling the narrative would prove impossible. By the time the sheriff left Thornwood Plantation that afternoon, taking Sarah to the county jail in Cahaba, the story had already begun spreading. The enslaved people at Thornwood whispered to enslaved people on neighboring plantations. Those whispers multiplied, traveling along the invisible networks of communication that connected the quarters across Dallas County and beyond. Within 3 days, enslaved people throughout the Black Belt knew that a girl named Sarah had killed Marcus Thornwood. Within a week, they knew she had done something unprecedented to him, something so devastating that white authorities were trying to suppress the details, which only made those details more powerful in their mythic form. The exact nature of what Sarah had done became elaborated, exaggerated, transformed into legend. Some said she had cut Thornwood into 100 pieces. Others claimed 200. Some said she had dismembered him while he was still alive and conscious. Others said she had drunk his blood and eaten his heart. The truth was buried beneath layers of rumor and counter-rumor, but the essential message remained constant. A 15-year-old enslaved girl had destroyed her master so completely that grown men couldn't speak of it without trembling. And that message, regardless of its specific details, carried enormous psychological power. Something unprecedented began happening across Dallas County and the surrounding region. Enslaved people started refusing to work, not violently, not through organized uprising, but through quiet, stubborn resistance. They gathered in their quarters and wouldn't leave. They stood in the fields but wouldn't pick cotton. They assembled in the yards but wouldn't respond to orders. Within 2 weeks of Thornwood's death, more than 400 enslaved people across half a dozen plantations had essentially gone on strike, refusing to work until Sarah received what they called justice. The plantation owners and local authorities were terrified. This was exactly the scenario they had feared, a coordinated resistance that threatened the entire economic and social system. Armed patrols were doubled. Militia units were activated. Planters rode between properties with rifles, searching for any sign of further organization or planning. But the assembled people remained peaceful. They committed no violence. They destroyed no property. They simply refused to work and waited to see what would happen to Sarah. The legal proceedings, such as they were, took place behind closed doors. Sarah was held in the county jail, a small brick building in Cahaba, while authorities debated what to do with her. Under Alabama's slave code, the law was clear. An enslaved person who murdered their master was to be executed swiftly and publicly as a warning to others. But this case presented complications that made the usual procedures impossible to follow. First, there was the question of Thornwood's character. When authorities searched his study thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain what had happened, they found his journals. Detailed records spanning more than 8 years, describing systematic torture, documenting previous victims, providing clinical notes about methods and results. The documents were so disturbing that Judge Samuel Morrison, who who would preside over Sarah's case, ordered them sealed immediately. "These cannot be made public," Morrison told the sheriff and the county prosecutor in a closed meeting. "If abolitionists in the North get hold of these journals, if they publish them as evidence of the cruelty inherent in slavery, the political consequences would be catastrophic. And if the enslaved population learns the full extent of what Thornwood was doing, it will provide justification for violence that we cannot contain." The prosecutor, a man named Garrett, tried to argue, but the journals provide context for what the girl did. They explain her actions. They demonstrate that Thornwood was engaging in activities that even by our standards were beyond acceptable conduct toward property. Morrison cut him off. "They demonstrate nothing except that one man was disturbed. They do not justify murder. They do not excuse what she did to him. Seal them, lock them away. They are never to be referenced in any legal proceeding." So the journals were removed from evidence, placed in a sealed iron box, and stored in the courthouse vault where they would remain, officially at least, for decades. Without the journals, there was no context for Sarah's actions, no explanation beyond the bare fact that she had killed Thornwood in a manner so brutal that authorities refused to describe it. Second, there was the matter of Sarah's confession. When questioned by the sheriff, she had admitted everything immediately, but she had done so with such complete absence of emotion, such flat affect, such dissociation from normal human response, that even hardened lawmen were disturbed. She showed no remorse, no fear, no recognition that she faced certain death. She answered questions in a monotone voice, provided details when asked, but offered no explanation or justification beyond a single statement. "He was making me disappear. I made him disappear instead." Third, and most troubling for county authorities, was the continued presence of hundreds of enslaved people who had stopped working and wouldn't disperse. They gathered in the forests and swamps around Cahaba, visible from town, their cooking fires dotting the landscape at night like stars. Their very existence a challenge to authority that couldn't be allowed to stand. The militia had enough force to disperse them violently, but doing so would likely spark the very uprising everyone feared. The situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Judge Morrison found himself facing an impossible choice. Executing Sarah would provoke the gathered people to violence. He had no doubt of that. The county didn't have sufficient military force to control a rebellion of that scale. Blood would flow. Property would be destroyed. The entire region would be destabilized. But failing to execute her would be seen as weakness, would suggest that enslaved people could murder their masters and escape justice, would encourage further resistance and rebellion. Either choice led to disaster. Morrison adjourned Sarah's trial without issuing a verdict, claiming he needed time to consider complex legal questions. In reality, he spent the next 5 days in frantic consultations with the governor in Montgomery, with neighboring county officials, with militia commanders, with prominent planters, trying to find a solution that would satisfy the demands of law while preventing the violence everyone feared. The solution, when it came, was characteristically Southern in its combination of pragmatism and duplicity. On August 2, 1847, Sheriff Pritchard issued a brief public statement. "The matter of Marcus Thornwood's death has been resolved in accordance with Alabama law. Justice has been served. All enslaved persons are ordered to return to their plantations immediately. Those who refuse will be considered in rebellion and dealt with accordingly." No details were provided. No verdict was announced. No execution was recorded in public records. Sarah simply vanished from official documentation after that date. No sale appears in any county registry. No death certificate was filed. Her name ceases to appear in any legal documents. She became a ghost, erased from history as thoroughly as she had erased Marcus Thornwood. The gathered enslaved people, after several more days of tense standoff, gradually dispersed and returned to their plantations. No violence occurred. No arrests were made. Life in Dallas County slowly returned to its normal rhythms, though an undercurrent of tension would persist for years. What actually happened to Sarah became the subject of endless speculation and remains a mystery to this day. Some claimed she was quietly executed and buried in an unmarked grave in the woods outside Cahaba. Others insisted she had been sold to a plantation in Texas or Louisiana, her identity obscured to prevent her from becoming a martyr. A few whispered that abolitionist agents had bribed officials to secure her release, that she had been smuggled north through the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. There was even a persistent rumor, never confirmed but never entirely dispelled, that Judge Morrison had made a secret deal. that Sarah had been purchased by Northern interests for an astronomical sum, that money had changed hands in darkness, that she had been transported out of Alabama, under cover of night, to live out her days somewhere far from the scene of her terrible vengeance. The truth was deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of official silence and unofficial myth-making. But certain facts are known. Thornwood Plantation was sold at auction in September 1847, purchased by a consortium of planters who divided the property among themselves. The big house was demolished that same autumn, its materials salvaged or burned, the site left empty. Within 3 years, the Alabama forest had begun reclaiming the land. Vines and undergrowth covering what had once been manicured grounds. The root cellar behind the kitchen house, the place Booker had sometimes visited with that haunted expression, was excavated by the new owners. What they found was never officially recorded, but workers who participated in the excavation refused to discuss it, and several left the area permanently shortly afterward. Local historians who later researched the matter found references to multiple burials, but no names, no death certificates, no explanation for why so many people would have been interred on the same property. Some speculated these were the graves of Thornwood's previous victims, girls who had undergone his experiments and not survived. Others believed they represented something more symbolic, perhaps 143 separate sites where parts of Thornwood had been buried, each piece interred individually in some grim memorial to Sarah's methodical vengeance. The truth was never established, and after a few years the question ceased to be asked. In the decades that followed, the story of Sarah and Marcus Thornwood became legend, then myth, then a cautionary tale whispered in the quarters of Alabama plantations and beyond. Among enslaved communities, Sarah became a folk hero, her name invoked as a reminder that even the most powerless person possessed the capacity for devastating resistance. That cruelty could breed consequences beyond imagination. That the human spirit, even when systematically dismantled, could reconstitute itself into something capable of terrible action. The number 143 became attached to her story permanently, though whether it was literal or symbolic was never determined. 143 pieces of a man who had tried to break her. 143 responses to 6 months of systematic torture. 143 reasons why silence in the face of cruelty is itself a form of violence. Among the planter class, she became a nightmare made real, rarely spoken of directly, but always present as a reminder that absolute power was never quite as absolute as it seemed. That treating enslaved people with excessive cruelty could provoke reactions that threatened the entire system. Several plantation owners in Dallas County quietly changed their practices after Thornwood's death, becoming less overtly brutal not from moral awakening but from pragmatic fear. The sealed journals remained in the courthouse vault in Cahaba until the town ceased being the state capital in 1826. Then they were transferred to a new facility, then another, moving through various archives as years passed. Some claimed the iron box was eventually opened, the journals examined by historians or curious officials, only to be quickly resealed when the contents proved too disturbing for public consumption. Others insisted the journals had been destroyed decades ago, that the sealed box contained nothing but ashes. Whether the journals still exist somewhere, hidden in some forgotten archive, or whether they were destroyed to prevent their contents from ever coming to light, remains unknown. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended through federal force rather than internal collapse. Alabama entered its long period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, violence and resistance continuing in new forms under new names. The story of Sarah faded from public memory, preserved only in oral traditions and in sealed documents that few people knew existed and fewer still were permitted to see. But in certain corners of Alabama, in certain communities with long memories, the story persisted. Older people would tell younger ones about the girl who had killed the master, who had refused to be erased, who had taken her vengeance with such devastating precision that authorities had to suppress the details to prevent widespread uprising. Whether she lived or died, whether she found freedom or remained in bondage until emancipation, whether she ever reclaimed her identity or remained Sarah forever, these questions were never answered with certainty. What remained was the undeniable fact of what she had done. On the night of July 19, 1847, a 15-year-old girl subjected to 6 months of systematic torture designed to destroy her identity had refused to accept that suffering as her fate. She had acted knowing that action meant almost certain death, choosing violence not from madness, but from a cold calculation that her life was already forfeit and therefore had nothing left to lose. She had become exactly what Marcus Thornwood had tried to make her, something reduced to pure function, something that existed only to serve a purpose. But the purpose she served was her own. She had dismantled him with the same methodical precision he had applied to dismantling her. And in doing so, she had created something that transcended her individual act. A legend, a warning, a reminder of what happens when human beings are pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The property that was once Thornwood Plantation has changed hands many times over the decades. It's been subdivided, developed, its dark history erased by time and deliberate forgetting. Modern residents of the area, if they know the story at all, associate it only vaguely with something terrible that happened long ago, the details lost to generations of silence. But the story persists in the places where such stories are kept alive. Here at the Sealed Room, we believe these buried histories deserve to be told. These suppressed narratives deserve to be heard. These uncomfortable truths deserve to confront us, even when they challenge everything we thought we knew about the past. The story of Sarah shows us that even in the darkest periods of American history, even in systems designed to completely dehumanize and control, individual acts of resistance could shake the foundations of power. The number 143 has echoed through generations as a reminder of what happens when human beings are treated as property, when cruelty becomes systematic, when the only choice left is between passive destruction and active vengeance. Was Sarah justified in what she did? That question has no simple answer. Marcus Thornwood's journals, if they still exist somewhere in a sealed vault, would provide context for her actions. They would document systematic torture spanning years. They would reveal previous victims who disappeared without trace. They would show a man who treated human suffering as scientific data, who refined his techniques through practice, who was conducting experiments in psychological destruction. But those journals were sealed specifically to prevent that context from becoming public, to prevent Sarah's actions from being understood as anything other than simple murder, to preserve a narrative that protected the institution of slavery rather than challenged it. Without that context, we're left with only the bare facts. A girl killed her master. She did so with such devastating thoroughness that authorities suppressed the details. And her act inspired hundreds of enslaved people to risk everything by refusing to work until they believed she had received justice. What form that justice took, whether Sarah survived or perished, whether she found freedom or simply exchanged one form of bondage for another, remains one of Alabama's most enduring mysteries. Some believe she's buried in an unmarked grave outside Cahaba. Others believe she escaped to the north and lived out her days in freedom, carrying the weight of what she had done but never regretting it. A few claim that she remained in Alabama, hidden in plain sight, her identity changed, her past erased, living among the descendants of the people she had inspired. There are even those who say that late at night in the forests that have reclaimed what was once Thornwood Plantation, you can sometimes hear singing. A woman's voice carrying across the darkness, singing the old songs that enslaved people used to communicate hope and resistance and survival. Whether it's Sarah's ghost or just the wind through the trees or the voice of history refusing to be silent, no one can say for certain, but the legend persists. The number 143 persists. The reminder persists that systems of oppression, no matter how absolute they appear, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. That human beings subjected to dehumanization will eventually resist in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. That cruelty breeds consequences. That silence in the face of evil is itself a form of complicity. The sealed documents remain sealed. The official records remain deliberately incomplete. The truth remains buried beneath layers of suppression and myth-making. But the story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature, about the will to survive, about the refusal to be completely erased, about what happens when someone who has lost everything discovers they still have one thing left. The capacity to act, the ability to choose, the power to become something other than what their oppressors tried to make them. Sarah's story is a chapter of American history that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths. It reveals the systematic cruelty that existed not as aberration, but as feature of the slavery system. It shows how that cruelty was documented, refined, treated as science rather than sadism. It demonstrates how authorities worked to suppress evidence that might challenge the narrative of benevolent paternalism they used to justify slavery. And it reminds us that resistance took many forms, from subtle acts of defiance to devastating acts of vengeance that could not be ignored or forgotten. 143 pieces. 143 reasons. 143 reminders that human beings cannot be owned completely, cannot be controlled absolutely, cannot be reduced to nothing no matter how systematic the attempt. Sarah proved that on the night of July 19, 1847, and the proof was so devastating, so absolute, so impossible to deny, that authorities had to seal the evidence and suppress the details and pretend it had never happened quite the way it did. But we remember. We tell these stories. We refuse to let them be buried completely, because buried truths have a way of emerging eventually, of demanding to be acknowledged, of insisting that history be told honestly rather than comfortably. What do you think of Sarah's story? Was she a murderer or a liberator? A victim or an avenger? Someone who descended into madness or someone who achieved a terrible clarity? Do you think she survived, or was her final act also her last? If you had been in her position, subjected to 6 months of systematic torture designed to destroy your identity, with certain death approaching, what would you have done? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it made you think about history in ways you hadn't considered before, subscribe to The Sealed Room. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another story from America's buried past. Share this with someone who appreciates historical mysteries that don't have easy answers. Stories that confront us with uncomfortable truths about who we were and who we've become. The past is full of stories that were deliberately suppressed, narratives that powerful people wanted erased, truths that challenge the comfortable myths we tell ourselves about history. But these stories deserve to be told. These voices deserve to be heard. These ghosts deserve to be acknowledged. Sarah deserves to be remembered, not as a monster or a martyr, but as a 15-year-old girl who endured 6 months of hell and emerged with enough strength to fight back, regardless of the cost. Thank you for listening to this dark chapter from Alabama's hidden history. The story of Sarah and Marcus Thornwood and the night that changed everything. 143 pieces of vengeance. 143 reasons to remember. 143 reminders that buried truths always find a way to surface eventually. Until next time, remember that history isn't just what's written in official records. It's also what's whispered in the darkness, what's sealed away in vaults, what's deliberately forgotten by those with power to control the narrative. And sometimes, if we listen carefully, we can still hear those buried voices calling out across the centuries, demanding to be heard, refusing to be silent, insisting that their stories matter. I'll see you in the next investigation.